Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Dharma Junkie Podcast. I know. Episodes have been few and far between lately. But hey, life happens, and sometimes you just have to prioritize things a bit differently. And with that being said, I'm going to be making a dedicated effort to put out my rather sizable backlog of episodes, and I've got some really cool guests lined up for the future that I think everyone will enjoy thoroughly. And to start that off, I'm going to introduce my guest today, Lisa Ernst. Lisa is a meditation teacher, artist, and founder of One Dharma Nashville. She's maintained a committed meditation practice for 30 years in the Zen and Vipassana traditions. Lisa's also received a full teaching authorization in the Thai forest spirit rock lineage of Ajahn Chah, Kornfield, and Trudy Goodman. She offers private meditation training, classes, and workshops, and she leads meditation retreats nationally. She's also a visiting teacher at Spirit Rock Meditation Center in Woodacre, California. In her teaching, Lisa emphasizes both transformational insight and everyday awakening as an invitation to embrace all of the path's possibilities. As a practicing visual artist, Lisa incorporates Dharma into contemplative photography and writing. She especially enjoys teaching students how to engage in the unknown, the mystery, and to work with open-ended, unanswered life questions that can't be solved through traditional logic. Lisa focuses on working with questions in meditation practice to support living from our truest intentions. And she was awesome to talk to. She was an amazing guest, and I felt connected to her almost immediately, and I think you will too. So without further ado, Lisa Ernst.
You might catch yourself sliding in and out of a hallucinatory state. Just relax and enjoy it. Just relax and enjoy it.
This is an experiment in mind formation. Information, forming, controlling, operating your mind and your brain. Using digital techniques to overload, scramble, confuse, unfocus your mind. The natural state of the brain is chaos. Chaos is beautiful.
Lisa Ernst, it is such a pleasure to have you. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you. Nice to be here.
Like I said, absolutely nice to have you. So you are a fairly well-known Dharma teacher in the United States. I've got some questions. How did you get started in this practice in the first place?
Well, it was kind of an interesting introduction. I was in high school, and there was a elective class on Zen Buddhism. Surprisingly, for Nashville, for the South, I thought that was pretty interesting that you could actually do something like that. So I signed on, and I absolutely fell in love with the teachings immediately. I was in a really difficult place in my life at the time. My father had just died, and my mother had already died. I was 16, and so my parents were already gone. And I couldn't make sense of life. And there was a teaching from the Buddha that came through in this class about impermanence and about how everything that arises passes away. And so that all of life is impermanent and will pass. And something about that one teaching, as simple as it is, struck something in me about what I was through, having lost my parents at such a young age. I was very aware of impermanence and death. And so that teaching gave me just a touch of comfort. It's not that it helped me totally overcome my grief or my loss or anything, but it just gave me a little sense of, I think Buddha knows what he's talking about here. I'm going to have to pursue this. And so it just intrigued me enough to begin to study Buddhism. And so I bought a lot of Buddhist books, and I wasn't really ready to start practicing yet, but it sort of set the stage for several years later when I actually began a formal practice. It was just like, okay, this is for me. It was just very obvious.
Yeah. So it sounds like your answer is pretty synonymous with everyone else's, and it's like, I kind of came to this path out of suffering.
Right.
Yeah, it seems to be the general cause if you become especially an American convert Buddhist. I think it's pretty much like, I experienced a lot of suffering, and it just made sense to me.
Absolutely, yeah. And since the Dharma path is suffering and the end of suffering, I think that is the doorway for many people, for sure. Yeah.
So you took this class in Zen, and you said it was a while before you actually started developing your own practice. You studied it, but so when did you actually evolve into your own practice? Like when did you actually like get on the cushion and start meditating and really like delving into these teachings and living through these teachings?
Yeah, it was a number of years later. I did try to meditate a little bit, in kind of my late teens, but I went down the wrong path, and I tried very intensive form of Kundalini practice that terrified me, kind of almost traumatized me a little bit. So I took some years off. And then, several years later, I was just at a local vegetarian restaurant, and up on the bulletin board was just a little sign, and all it said was Zen meditation. And there was a phone number. So I just grabbed the number, and I was just beginning to get into therapy for, a lot of PTSD and losses in my life. And
How old were you at this time?
About 30, I think. I mean, when I seriously took it up, I had dabbled with it before, but that's when I really got committed.
Right.
And so that was the point where I felt motivated, because I needed psychological support, and I needed spiritual support. And I was entering into therapy finally, which I needed. And so I did a dual path of really dealing with my emotional and psychological suffering that came out of the losses, and also taking it onto the cushion. And so that's when I got serious. And I went to this Zen meditation group. It was just somebody's house, maybe about 6 people were there.
Right.
And, but I knew immediately that it was my path. There was a weekend retreat. There was a retreat coming up the very next weekend, and a teacher was coming into town, and one of the students said, "Oh, you ought to come for the day." And so I showed up the next Saturday. With Zen, you start at like 4:30 in the morning. And I showed up, and we sat all day until 9 o'clock in the evening. And most of the time I thought, this is nuts. What the hell am I doing here? And if I lost my mind completely,
Right.
I didn't know what I was doing. But what happened was I walked out of that retreat that evening, and there was just something that had just shifted. I felt a little bit lighter. I felt a little freer. And it was just a moment where it's like, I'm going to do as many retreats as I can. I'm going to do this as much as I can. And so there was just that commitment. And I started sitting every day. I don't think I missed any days at all. I just got on that cushion and went for it. And, just really made it a huge commitment in my life.
Right. And about how long would you say you were sitting per day at that time?
I was sitting about 30 minutes.
Right.
It was pretty focused and concentrated. And so it was, very effective, in terms of even though it wasn't like really long periods of time. And I also found a Sangha very quickly, that I really committed to. And so it became a really big part of my life pretty quickly.
Right on. Yeah, I've actually been surprised at the level of Dharma available in Nashville. There's so much. There's so much going on there. Yeah, I'm friends with Mikey Noshel and Andrew Chapman at Wild Heart. And I'm going through facilitator training with them. And as I've been going to Nashville, I keep hearing about more and more stuff going on in Nashville. It's like, wow, there's a lot of Dharma in Nashville.
I'm not sure why, but does seem to be a hub in the Southeast, or one of them anyway. You're right.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of like my goal is to kind of spread it further south. I'm in Pensacola. And so I started a sitting group here, and because we didn't really have anything like that here. So kind of my mission is to spread it down here as much as I can. So you started Zen, and when did you get into more of the Thai forest Ajahn Chah lineage? You did move from Zen into more of a Theravada background, right?
Yes, it was about 10 years in. Okay. And what happened was, to be truthful, there was at this time there were a lot of scandals happening in Zen of teachers who were engaging in sexual misconduct. And my teacher was kind of one of them. And I didn't realize it for about 10 years. And I felt at that time the reform wasn't yet happening. I think there's been a lot of reform since then. Right. But at the time, the reform wasn't happening. The teacher that I connected with, Trudy Goodman, who I had met through Zen, had also shifted into the Insight tradition. And so I was interested in some of her experiences and teachings. And so the first thing I did after that 10-year period was I went and I did a 5-day metta retreat. And so that was really my first encounter with really intensive metta practice. And so that really shifted me into the insight tradition at that point. I think what I liked about the insight tradition was the emphasis on sila, and that having a foundation in ethical conduct was really important. And I found it being emphasized more there than what I was experiencing in Zen at the time. And I really felt that was important to me, to have that safety, that container of ethical conduct as part of the foundation. And so that really attracted me to the insight tradition, as well as the emphasis on loving kindness and metta that was really, really developing and opening up at that point.
Right. Yeah, I would definitely have to agree that it seems that the emphasis really is put on sila within the Theravadan lineage, and that's really what attracted me to it. I have a recovery background. I'm in recovery from addiction, and so for me, it was like the fifth precept was like, oh, okay, and just living that ethical life, really changing the way that I bring myself into the world, and ultimately it changed my practice, because I started meditating when I was in jail. That's where I learned to meditate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was like 2000. Maybe 14, I think. So, that's when I really started to get on the cushion, but I didn't really start delving into the practices until after I was able to get out and actually get some literature and actually learn about it. I had taken some like comparative religion classes and stuff in like high school, but other than that, I didn't really have any exposure to. I was interested in it, but I didn't know enough, really know much about it. But for me, it was that shift in ethical, the ethical portion of my life that really gave me the push on the cushion, because when I stopped doing all the unskillful action, I stopped having all the unskillful things arise in my practice, because that's
right.
the first stuff that comes up, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, kind of hard to get to Panya when you're still dealing with all the stuff you did yesterday.
That's right. It's true. Yeah. And I really think that emphasis, and Buddha's teachings on remorse being something that can be wholesome and skillful, when we recognize that this is not something that I want to continue, that we can use that as not as a way to beat ourselves up, but as a way to recognize, okay, this is unskillful. Can I let this go? Can I do that to support my life in a way that gives me more capacity and ability to meditate and to bring the Dharma into the world in a meaningful way.
Right. So when did you start to get involved in teaching? You say you were in Zen, and then you got involved with the Theravadan lineage. And when did that kind of start shifting into more of a, like, wow, I kind of want to teach this?
Yeah, it went back and forth. I came along at a time when the road and the availability for teaching was more limited, in that, there wasn't as much of the secular, or it was beginning, the secular mindfulness was opening up, but it was still more a lineage based, in terms of getting to a point where you're teaching. And so at that point, Trudy was my teacher, and I brought forward to her about possibly moving into teaching. And at that point, she was like, well, why don't you just practice some more for a while? And then I saw her again several years later, and she said, how do you feel about teaching right now? And I said, I don't know. I've kind of let it go. And she said, I think you're ready to teach. So it just kind of opened up. I guess there was a shift. And so that's changed now. There's much more emphasis on training and teaching than there was. This was more kind of lineage-based, a lineage-based approach to really developing a certain level of spiritual maturity, and then getting a lineage transmission, and which I got in 2010. So I got the lineage transmission in the Ajahn Chah tradition. But since Trudy and I were both from the Zen background, we were using the terminology of transmission, because in Zen, that's kind of how it's done, is through Dharma transmission. So, and just to say, I still love Zen and I love the teachings of Zen. I just don't like the way it had evolved in America for a good length of time. And hopefully that's improving a lot now.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on back then that, and still, I think a lot of iffy behavior in some certain sects, but
yeah,
we can't, just throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think in this case,
Right.
So what are you doing now?
With my teaching and my Dharma.
Yeah, just in general. Tell me
Oh, in
about
general, yeah.
a day in the life of Lisa.
Well, I'm moving into an apartment while we're remodeling our house. So there's been a little adjustment there, kind of moving into a smaller space. But, the daily activities, for time, even as I started teaching, I was a visual artist, and I did that professionally for a good length of time. And so I still have my hand in art, but I've shifted over to more what I call contemplative photography, which I used to teach. I used to teach day-long retreats on contemplative photography where we would get together with our cameras and we would move into a meditative state, and then we would take pictures. So we weren't looking for a pretty shot. We were letting it come to us. So it's sort of like that open receptivity of mindfulness and awareness. And so I still love to do that. It's very relaxing. It's just such a meditative way of being out in nature, which I love to do. And I try to get out most every day and do either mindful photography if I can, or, sometimes it's just a hike, a regular get out and go fast. But that's almost always part of my day. And of course, meditating, teaching, I have clients, people that I work with one-on-one, and then I run One Dharma Nashville. So I have various activities regarding that. I'm currently wrapping up a teacher training myself, which will end in December. And so I've been doing that this year. And I teach a number of residential retreats throughout the country every year. And so, kind of working on that. I have one coming up at the early December. So that's right around the corner. So, and then my husband, I'm married. My husband and I both work at home. So, we hang out and get out and walk in the morning and, have fun together, have a good time together. So he's a big part of my life. So that too.
Yeah, that's great. So where's this upcoming retreat in December going to be at?
It's a place called Bethany Hills, and it's in Kingston Springs, which is 40 minutes outside of Nashville, I think. And it's a nice retreat center. We've been using them for about 10 years, I think. We've been running retreats there. And so since COVID has kind of opened up, since, we've had more openings this year, we kind of back at Bethany Hills in the spring after a couple of years. And so this will be our second time, back in person since COVID in December. And we're full, we're filled up. And, we run I do a couple of local retreats per year at Bethany Hills. And so we do a spring and a winter. And so that's, that one's coming up. And then I also have a New Year's retreat out in Big Bear, California, through Inside LA that I teach with a teacher out there, Inside LA teacher, Thomas Davis. And that's like December 28th through January 2nd. And that's still open for people to register if they'd like. But that one I did that one last year. And it's just a beautiful place to do a kind of end of year retreat.
Right. So coming back post COVID, have you noticed more people getting involved in retreats, like more registrations? Have you noticed more of an interest in this practice as like post COVID as opposed to pre COVID?
It's been kind of mixed. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of like some of the people who had been regular before have kind of fallen away. Maybe their priorities shifted or they got out of the habit because of COVID. But then we're also seeing an influx of new people who are getting more on board for retreats. And so it's kind of a mix. I would say, it's both kind of some patterns shifted for some people, but then new people are coming in and developing. And then, of course, there are the people that kept going all the way through COVID and did online retreats, and those people are coming back in person. So I'd say it sort of almost balances itself out. That's kind of been my experience.
Right. Yeah, I think that's been what I've seen as well, especially, having joined the board of Flowering Lotus and just looking at the numbers pre-COVID and the numbers post-COVID. It's like, yeah, it seems to be like a little bit of an ebb and flow, maybe lose some people, gain some people. But it seems to me that the overall interest in this practice is growing from my perspective. Yeah.
I think it's definitely growing in terms of just like what we talked about. People are recognizing and needing those avenues to address their suffering in some way. And COVID certainly threw everything upside down for people, and just knowing that the Dharma is such a powerful resource, I think is I think more and more people are just recognizing that, which just different avenues, perhaps, in ways of people are receiving Dharma. COVID shook that up a bit because now a lot of people like to do Zoom retreats. Some people love to just pop on Zoom and do a retreat, and that's fine. I think it makes it, what's positive about that is it makes it accessible in cases where it might not have been accessible before. And I think that's a really great development.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. So moving forward, you've got a book coming out, right?
I'm working on it. I'm just about done with the manuscript. So, about ready to go into the marketing mode, but yeah, I'm just now wrapping up. I've had a little disruption with all the moving and the remodeling and all that, but getting ready to kind of focus in on the next phase of that. But yeah, I'm just about done with the manuscript now, so excited about that.
Yeah, could you tell me a little bit about the book? Can we get a sneak preview?
Yeah, absolutely. So the working title is Everyday Awakenings, and I've had several teachers review it, and one person that read it, Sylvia Borstein, read it, and she suggested the subtitle be something to the effect of "My Story for Your Freedom." And I thought, wow, that's quite a subtitle. So that says it. It's my story. It's really sort of my journey, my path in and through the Dharma, my path through the suffering that I went through, and the ways in which the Dharma has helped me, navigate this life, and then a lot of teachings. And so I'll have some stories, and then I'll have segments with teachings and guided practices, how to. So I making it both a story and then also very practical in terms of how to apply the teachings.
Don't you really feel that that's the way that the Dharma should be taught, like through our own experience? Like, because if we're just reciting suttas, that's one thing, but when we can actually explain how the Dharma lives through us and how it shows up in our lives, I think that's really the way to teach, isn't it?
I agree, and that is very much how I teach. I feel like the value that I can bring to the teaching and to spreading the Dharma is through sharing how it has really affected my life and how I've applied it, what it's meant to me. And so for me, finding that and sharing that with people is, I think the most important thing, because then it can say, here's the possibilities, of people that have had difficult lives and great obstacles. And, when we can share how the Dharma has helped us, it really shows and demonstrates in a very concrete way how meaningful it is in this contemporary time. And we can always, kind of tie our teachings back to the sutras or to traditional teachings, but then bringing it forward and really bringing it into this lived experience, I think is what shows people how it can be lived and how accessible it can be.
Right. Yeah, I really agree. And I say, I say that if we're just studying suttas, it can seem really impractical, but it's that bridge of bringing the old teachings to our modern experience that really does make it accessible for people. And they're like, oh, okay, so you've been through this extraordinarily difficult experience in your life, and you've managed to traverse that through this practice. And I think it gives people some hope, and it gives them a little. They're more apt to put in the effort when they're like, oh, this can be done.
I think that's really that's to me the most meaningful thing, is to really say this can actually be done and it's real, and you can see real shifts in your life, based on living it and doing it. So yeah, and I think that's probably one of the most important roles of a teacher, is to really to reveal possibilities, for this practice and how it can be lived. And that it's not just something that's left on the shelf, but can really be applied.
Yeah. The Dharma is definitely a living thing. It's not just on paper, for sure.
That's right. Yeah.
So this teacher training that you've been doing, how's that been? Was that the first one that you've done? And if not, like, what's that experience like for you as the teacher teaching your students? I'd love to get some insight into that.
Sure. Yeah, I did a facilitator training back in 2018, and so that it wasn't the first time, but it was a little different. The facilitator training was a little more kind of I would say, earlier stage. It was facilitator, and so it was for people who just wanted to start to learn to teach the Dharma. This is a little more advanced. This class was designed for people who'd had more experience, and most of them already had some form of teaching experience, and had a good amount of retreat experience primarily. So there was already some momentum in what they were doing in the Dharma, and some of them had already had experience, just leading classes, for instance, like leading groups. So it was kind of taking people to the next step. And then it was also for some people who are more on the retreat track, where they're, teaching retreats or moving toward teaching retreats. So there was kind of a dual track that I'm offering. And I think it's been a really nice experience for folks. I mean, it's always ultimately, I think, with these kinds of trainings, is that community that develops within the training, and that sense of shared, that Sangha. It becomes its own Sangha in a sense, and that shared support and ways of learning together, ways of applying the Dharma in terms of how to teach it. It's just something that, when it's done in a group setting, just creates a sense of solidarity and learning together. I think it really creates a nice community that isn't available just through kind of private mentoring.
Right. I would definitely agree with that, because I've seen that play out 100% in the training that I'm in. It's like our little group has gotten so tight just over the past year, that we've been doing this training. It's like, and you can see it grow too, like from the first weekend that we all met, and then you get some people that kind of fall away and don't want to continue the training, and then the people that are left over, like we've all become so close. It's really a profound experience. It's like my family away from my family, like, because your Sangha's family anyway, but there's this special level of it. I feel personally going through this training, because it's such an intensive training. It's not just like, oh, well, you do this, do that, do this, do that. It's really like learning these relational exercises and doing them with each other, and then like really growing because of that.
Yeah, that's right. It's the application, learning together, where you're really applying the teachings and the practices. We've had a lot of people learning, just practicing Dharma talks and learning how to really with a peer group where they can get feedback on their talks, and just ways of connecting together that I think is just really more practical and helpful than just trying to just do it out on your own. Like, I'm going to give a Dharma talk tonight. I don't know maybe the audience likes my talk. I don't know. There's kind of like, there's always a question mark there. So it's nice to have a peer group that can offer feedback and connect in that way.
Absolutely. It can be a little overwhelming getting that feedback sometimes.
Yeah. And then it's my job to maybe be able to sharpen the more too.
So other than the retreats that you've mentioned, do you have anything else coming up next year? What's going on?
Yeah, I've got, of course, back at Bethany Hills in April, and got a Costa Rica retreat with David Cabrera, who I teach with in May. And so that's coming up. That's something new. I haven't done a retreat in Costa Rica before, and that should be a beautiful experience. It's like a 6-night, 7-day retreat. And it'll be a retreat and exploration, some mindful movement, just a lot of, kind of spaciousness around, but still practicing. And I did a tour of India back in 2017. So I've done one sort of international tour. And so this is a little closer to home, hopefully a little bit easier to access, but also a really beautiful place. So, and then after that, just more retreats. I just have multiple. Usually teach 5 or 6 residential retreats a year through various organizations. And so that's coming along, and marketing the book.
For sure. So I have a question.
Sure.
Let's talk Nibbana. Let's talk awakening.
Mm-hmm.
What would you define that as for you?
Yeah. I think for me, there's several different orientations on that. There is the kind of awakening that is what I think of as everyday awakening, that in the midst of our lives, we have insights, we have clarity, that informs, how we live and helps us to, let go of a certain level of suffering. And I see that especially through the lens of seeing through the pernicious sense of self, the identification with I and mine that creates so much suffering, and just seeing through that to the kind of emptiness that is interconnected. And just through the course of practice and living life, there are those insights that help us let go of the grip of suffering, of self-identification, of I and mine, I'm not, all of that opens. But I think then there's the cultivation that comes through dedicated practice, that comes through doing retreats, that comes through years of insight. And so I think to me, there's this dual way of awakening. There's the everyday, more, we could almost say mundane awakening. And then there is the deeper cultivation that we have through our practice that opens us slowly to deeper levels of awareness and insight that often can have a moment of clarity, like a deep opening that really changes our whole life. And then we take it out and we apply it in a more everyday fashion. And so I see it in that dual track, but I don't look at awakening or enlightenment as this sort of place up on the mountain where you're immune to the human vicissitudes of suffering. Right, I don't, yeah. I like using it as a way to inoculate ourselves from suffering. I don't look at it that way, but I see it as something that can be cultivated, and that is something that's available just through the commitment of, following the path in a way that helps us open our hearts to compassion and insight.
Right. So would you say that nibbana and equanimity are kind of hand in hand?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't have one without the other. It would be hard to have one without the other, for sure. Yeah. But I do think, I look at it as something that I think it's important to see the fluidity of it, that while we have these times of deep clarity, we're still human. And I like the teaching, and this is kind of a Zen teaching, Zen Master Dogen, which is a brilliant, founder of the Soto Zen tradition. And one of the teachings that I've found to be very true in my own life is a teaching that delusion and enlightenment are not separate. And that if we look into delusion in this very moment, in the midst of delusion, we can find the awakened mind. That in one way we cultivate it, and in another way we look at the matter at hand. And if we can skillfully see it, then in that very moment, the awakened mind is right there with us, because it's this awareness, this great spacious awareness is always here. It's just that we normally can't see it until we cultivate, the capacity to see into the clinging and the suffering and the craving that is with us, and so that the possibility of this enlightened mind is always present, and it's not someplace else, even though we have to cultivate our practice of awakening, but it's always here. And sometimes in my most tangled moments, there's just one little turn of awareness and everything opens up. And then that equanimity and that clarity and that understanding of emptiness, of no self, just opens itself up, and it's like, free. Right. Here is the freedom from suffering right in this moment. And Ajahn Chah speaks of, he said there's two kinds of suffering. The suffering you run away from, and so it follows you everywhere. And the suffering you face, and so you become free. And so I see this as something we can do at any moment.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me of Ajahn Buddhadasa and his nibbana for everyone. He said, if nibbana wasn't always present, we would absolutely just go insane from reactivity. And yeah. I think that's really true. Like if we weren't able to tap into it, even unknowingly, and I think we hit that place of nibbana every day, multiple times a day. We're just not, the mind isn't trained enough to notice it.
Yeah, that's right. And as we train ourselves, then it's like, here it is. And I do think that's part of the unwinding, is that we keep, then as we train, we see into it more and more. So it's like, it's not up on the hill, or around the corner.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I'm still very much a human being. I fall back asleep all the time and get that really strong sense of self, and like get super impatient about things. I'm like, no, I want it now.
Absolutely.
What am I?
I get it. And I think even the most, accomplished teachers still have that part of their humanity that's going to pop in. And I think that's part of the compassion piece is recognizing our humanity and saying, okay, I'm not going to get it right all the time. It can I be compassionate when, I really fall off of what I think of as being the perfect path. And then we start, and I think as we get further along, that becomes more obvious,
Yeah, for sure. Well, what propelled you to write a book? What was the impetus behind that?
I started to write a book. I actually did write a book years ago. After I started practicing, I found so much value in the path that I began to write about it. And I wrote this book that was really kind of my early experiences in the Dharma. And what happened was I got an agent, I got a publisher, but I didn't have any credentials. So they wrote back and said, you need to have a co-writer. And I'm like, nah, I think I'm just going to let this project go for now. And so it had been on the back of my mind that I was going to revisit it and then revise it based on my much more experienced self in a sense that, and so I just finally had an opportunity last year. I'd been looking around and I heard about a couple Dharma teachers who are also professional writers who are doing this course on actually writing a book, not how to write or, kind of like a writer's group that just hangs out, but I mean, a real serious writing workshop that we did for about a year. And so I just went into that last year and did it and took advantage of the opportunity to really zero in on it and make a commitment to do it. And kind of some writers and I, Trudy and some other writers and I would kind of get together and on Zoom, we would just make an appointment and then we would all just write. We just have our cameras on, turn off the sound and write together. And it's like this incredible support system, this cool. Writing sangha.
Who taught that class?
And really helped to get some discipline, in terms of actually doing it. And so that's so I've been thinking about it for a number of years and just finally thought, okay, I'm going to actually do it. It was, let's see, Tanya Castile and Sean Murphy, and they're out in
so
New Mexico.
Seeing
and it's called Right to the Finish.
In places
and,
like that, like applying the Dharma
these classes
to
all
writing
the time,
or
I think, every year,
to cooking
so,
or to anything of that nature.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing so much more of that now. And I just love that. I love the translation of the Dharma into the seemingly mundane acts of life, because, we can talk about Vedana and, the pleasant, unpleasant, neutral experiences. And it seems for me, it's like most people are so, and I'm guilty of this too. I'm so apt to rush towards the next pleasant thing that I oftentimes overlook everyday, seemingly mundane beauty of existence itself,
Yeah. I think that's such a huge aspect of being human is those things that we think of as neutral or boring that we want to get past. And of course, that's the very description of ignorance in Buddhism is we ignore. And so the ignorance is ignoring what our minds don't want to see. And so often that is the more mundane. And yet, the beauty, I think, is in as we turn ourselves toward it and we pay attention and we don't reject those experiences. To me, that is one of the ways that really lead to equanimity is when our minds are able to really hold and allow ourselves to be in the experience of things that we normally overlook. And
Dharma is
to me, that's
visible,
I think one of the powerful practices of Vedana is encouraging
well, thank you so much for your time. I
ourselves
really appreciate
to
you
really
taking
pay
the time
attention
to me and,
to what we're normally
talk
ignoring.
about the Dharma
and
in your
that's
book
a lot,
and your practice. It's I always love getting insight from different teachers, and it's been a pleasure having this conversation, and it's been a pleasure to meet you. Big thanks again to Lisa Ernst for being on the podcast. If you'd like to get in touch with her, she can be found at lisaernstmeditation.com. And if you're ever in Nashville, be sure to check out One Dharma Nashville. Thanks again for listening. And as I said, I'll be trying to get more episodes out more frequently. I appreciate you continuing to listen through all the ups and the downs and the worldly winds of life. This has been Dharma Junkie. I'm Justin. Namaste.